Hello, and welcome to the Friday Lunchtime Show with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. Today is Friday, the 28th of February, 2025, and our guest Andrew Wilkinson will be discussing mental models for smarter school leadership. We're looking forward to having many of you call or text in. Listen and enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to the Friday Lunchtime Show with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. We are so excited today because we are going to be looking at leadership models. And this can be quite intense because I think that it's very interpretive. Todd, are you here with us today?
I am, yes. How are you?
Lovely. It's lovely to hear your voice. How's your week been?
Brilliant. Yeah, really nice week. Really, really nice week. How about yours?
Busy. It was such a busy week. I actually have leadership on the mind because I just came from a women's conference on leadership. So this is actually a really, really great show to catch me at because it's just on the forefront of my mind what it means to be a leader and what it means to be in a school with great leadership.
Okay. Well, I think Andrew's our man then because I think we've got lots and lots here to unpick, eh?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have Andrew on. Andrew is one of those people that I met before I met him. So Andrew and I had corresponded and seen each other just through various things in research ed. And I'm really excited because I had read a lot of his work before I met him. So Andrew Wilkinson is an assistant head teacher at Al Rabna School, and he's also the CEO of Classify Education and the host of the Learning Curve School Leadership podcast. He's passionate about evidence-informed practice. He's dedicated to learning from and sharing the experiences of outstanding school leaders and how to drive meaningful change in education. Andrew's one of those people that is so considerate and giving, and he asks the most insightful questions of leaders that he meets. And I feel like he collects all of these great observations and distills them. So I'm really excited to enter into this conversation. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hello. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It's so good to have you. When we were discussing what we wanted to talk about when we were looking at leadership, the very first thing that you brought up was the idea of a lattice work of mental model and Charlie Munger's philosophy. Do you think that you could explain what the lattice work of mental models is and how that might be applied in educational leadership?
Yeah, I'll have a go, but I'm concerned that I'm going to absolutely butcher it because Charlie Munger is one of the most thoughtful and wise people that I've ever kind of read about or listened to. So just for context, if people don't know who Charlie Munger is, he is the investment partner of Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, and those two gentlemen have built obviously one of the most successful, if not the most successful, public company in America, and they are just again so thoughtful. They host an amazing event every year and invite all their shareholders together. And yeah, they've just been absolutely fantastic, and they've got a whole world of wisdom that I think is useful to not only investors, teachers, educators, and all forms of life. Unfortunately, Charlie Munger is no longer alive. He died earlier this year, or back end of last year, and I think it's just been a really poignant time for me to kind of think and reflect on some of his things. So, like you said, Morgan, his lattice work, the mental models, is probably what he'll be most remembered for. And this idea was that he thought if you took the biggest ideas from the biggest disciplines, that you could essentially not make really intelligent decisions, but more avoid stupid decisions. And that was what he was really great about. I liked that approach of like he thought intelligence was essentially being less stupid over a long period of time. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
I think that's really interesting. We were talking about how we shouldn't just look at one domain of knowledge or one area of expertise, but education should be borrowing from other industries and other domains that could help make our practice better. Which makes a lot of sense because we are teachers who come up in schools and we're not exposed. I think it's really funny that as you go further up a school, you're expected to be an expert, perhaps in running a large business, a large corporation, and with many, many different moving parts that might have marketing and human resources. And all of those things are very different than the skill set of a teacher, which I think is really, really fascinating. You're basically the mayor of a small town. But you have training in something completely different. So borrowing from different disciplines, whether that be economics or history or for psychology or mathematics, like whether that's technological, it makes complete sense that we look outside of the field of education to learn more about how to lead well.
No, absolutely, and again with Charlie Munger, he was really careful in terms of it's not about taking from every single discipline, but about really being thoughtful and then really almost concentrating that reading into the most poignant and most big ideas from them. So, for example, I
Yeah,
mean, if I just look at history, for example, one of his biggest things was the most influential people, and almost making friends with the eminent dead was his core. And
Mm.
he'd be a big fan of, say, Benjamin Franklin and these huge historical figures. And he read a lot of biographies as a means of developing that friendship with the eminent dead, as we say.
I like that expression, making friends with the eminent. That's interesting. And this lattice work model, I didn't actually. I know a little about Munger, but didn't actually know about this until you brought it up, Andrew. I'd kind of this concept came to me through Clive Woodward, who talks about 3D learning. His model essentially with England, and I think in his work before England in software and later in other industries as kind of an advisor is model of discover, distill, do, which he calls 3D learning. And the idea is that you capture and share something from somewhere could be another arm of your same sector, but more likely it's from outside the sector. And then you identify the sort of key points or key parts of the strategy, and then then you do, and you kind of make deliberate practice, and you check against that sort of key characteristics component. Um, and that's kind of the model of learning that he implemented. So all the England players, when they joined for the first time, had to bring something from their club team. But he'd also go over and speak to, say, for example, um, people who'd worked in the military or people who'd worked in finance. And there's a very famous example of him speaking to, I think, a Japanese chap. And he basically says to him, I don't know anything about the Japanese. I think he's a professor. I'll have to check this. But says to him, well, what is this sport of rugby? What are the fundamentals of rugby? And after a lot of bluster, Woodward basically works out that he doesn't actually know. And so he goes back to his team and says, look, I went to try and learn something from this man, and he asked me a question and I don't know the answer. And they did exactly the same thing as him. They blustered and blustered and blustered. And then he said, we actually need to work out what are our 5 fundamentals of the game we're actually trying to do. And then we'll work it outwards from there. So I sometimes think just, when you're outside of your sector or where you're trying to learn from elsewhere, there is definitely something about trying to explain it really simply to someone who understands something else really, really well, that makes you realize, actually, I just act this out. Do I actually understand what it is exactly, what my core principle or key principle is? So it
No,
really
that's a really
fascinating
interesting
idea.
one.
Yeah, there's a
I think
few
I,
things there to kind of unpick. I think, Andrew, you were kind of saying you have to pick the right strategies from the right places because not all knowledge is equally valuable. Munger was all about the idea of picking out the best ideas from what might be applicable out there in different sectors and applying them effectively. So instead of just knowing everything, the idea is that you build those principles that you were talking about, Todd. So having those big principles allows you to have a toolbox that you can use when you are problem solving, which is a really great way to look at leadership, that we actually look outside of ourselves a lot and then we apply what works in other situations really skillfully. Yeah, I think that that's a really good place to start with this idea of lattice work and kind of building up our skills or toolbox. What would you add to that, Andrew?
No, I think it's a good start, and I really like what Todd was saying there about that 3D model, and there's something about being able to crystallize, your fundamentals. I think there's a famous physicist, I think it was Richard Feynman, and when he was talking about learning and learning new disciplines and principle, it was all about you have to be able to explain it to an 8-year old, and that was his model. And I think as teachers and educators, we're almost in the ideal sphere where whatever we're learning, we've got the opportunity to speak to 8-year olds and speak to children on a regular basis. And look, do I think we should be going and explaining the laws of thermodynamics or incentives and things to children as we read from maybe textbooks or specialists in the domain? No, but if we can take that and explain it in a way that's understandable for them, it shows that we can crystallize that thinking and then take it forward in terms of how we run departments and change leadership and things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. So when we look at lattice work or mental models, I always think, well, when I have learned about educational leadership by doing different courses, I'm always kind of told about leadership styles. And a lot of the times we're asked to pigeonhole our educational leadership, and we're told often about those leadership styles. And I think common ones might be transformational leadership, it might be servant or instructional or directive leadership. And I think that those are nice kind of ideas that we have these different types of leadership in education. But at the same time, I feel like there's something really fluid and adaptive and agile about leadership, that we constantly use these different facets of these different styles in order to be effective leaders. So we're not just using one tool in our toolbox. And I think there's a few things that we could go into. It might be a good place to start to just look at some of these different leadership styles, and then see how they could be applied differently. Why don't we start, Todd? If you had to describe one of these leadership styles, transformational, servant, instructional, which one is your favorite and why?
Oh, I don't really particularly like the terms. I'll be honest with you, Morgan. I think
I expected that.
I think between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m., you're probably about 4 or 5 different styles of leader, depending on who you're talking to and what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And um, I think that I've never really found peace with that model, because it strikes me that you're not really necessarily one thing to all people at all times. So yeah, it's hard to kind of give an answer that's going to move you forward here. But what are you thinking? Would you say you do fit into one of those nice and neatly?
I think it's really funny. I think that I don't see myself in any of these in any fixed capacity, but I feel like I've seen some of these in action. So I was actually talking with a friend before this show about transformational leadership and directive leadership. And I was saying that transformational leadership is supposed to be focusing on inspiring and motivating teachers and students. It's having a shared vision. It's about sharing that vision and making it so clear that everyone knows the path that they're working towards, and they feel that in the culture of the school. They feel empowered to walk towards that vision. And this is a way to transform what's happening in your school, in your environment. And I feel, as much as transformational leadership has kind of created this idea that heads or principals can come in and completely change a school in 1 year by just having the right vision and making everyone kind of walk towards it like it's a beacon.
Mm.
And I feel like there's a lot of nonsense in that. There's a lot of more skill than just a few inspirational speeches. I feel like I've seen transformational leadership when I was part of a startup school and we had a leader who was really good at getting people on board with the vision and getting them to all work towards that same goal. and having such high expectations and kindness wrapped up in that vision, which was really, really inspiring. So I feel like I've seen transformational leadership. I know that it was tempered with other leadership things, but I do recognize that it exists, and it's a type of leadership that could be quite useful in certain situations. On the other hand, I look at something like servant leadership. I was discussing this when I was at a workshop with a friend, the power of servant leadership and the idea that servant leaders, they lead by looking at power. So they look at power as not being hierarchical in a school, but they look at it as being the exact opposite. Power comes from the bottom of the pyramid and inverting it so that teachers have a lot of the power, and it's from there that you can drive change. It's not about kind of groveling to your staff, but instead it's about serving by collaboration, empathy, and by creating an environment where everyone can thrive. And I think I see that collaboration in a lot of leaders, and you can see distributed leadership kind of fitting in there as well. And instructional leadership is something that I think is really popular right now. So you're looking at curriculum, teacher development, student achievement, data driven decision making, how we can make professional development and classroom support the key thing that will change a school. So very, 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 very focused on like pedagogy and the curriculum as drivers and agents of change. Yeah, so I think those three ones are the ones that I'm kind of like just putting out there. There are, of course, many, many more different types of leadership. And I see your point, Todd. Like, if I go over those three types, do you have any comments? Andrew, what about you? Andrew, what do you think when you hear about these three types of leadership and maybe what they might mean in other industries besides education?
I think they're cool to think about and really reflect on. And similar to what Todd was saying, there's a place for all three of those and other leadership styles, and they come and go and ebb and flow, as is the nature of school. I think when I'm trying to reflect on my own leadership and then listening to you there, I think at times I've probably erred on the side of the instructional leadership and thinking that's the most important thing. And then speaking to other leaders through the podcast, which I've obviously been very lucky to do, hearing them speak about that servant leadership side is something that's very aspirational. And I mean, I've spoken to a few leaders. I'm thinking of some of these in Dubai, Michelle Hines, who's obviously on this show, Morgan, yourself, and Todd. Whether it's servant leadership, you'd say all of the people I've just mentioned there come with a heavy listening side and active listening and removing barriers. And I think that's something that as leaders we do or aim to do. And certainly listening to you guys, I felt very inspired that I was like, right, how can I go back and what barriers can I remove so that instructional side or, the maximize the time in the classroom can be the main focus of what I'm trying to do and trying to drive change. And I think that's been really interesting lens to look at. With transformational leadership, it's interesting because if you get it right, it's amazing. But I'd imagine of the three looking at there, it's maybe got the most downside in terms of if it goes wrong. I think I've been in the UAE for 7 years and probably seen a lot of change. And the nature of education here can be quite transient. And if you get a lot of leaders coming in thinking they're going to be transformational, they might go into one school year, implement a bunch of change, leave the next year, new leader comes in, and again, just that constant iteration can be really demotivating for staff, I suppose, who've
Yeah,
seen it
there's
all
definitely
before.
like yeah, it becomes like an implementation fatigue, doesn't it? Like, oh, the last guy said he was here forever and he was going to change this. And particularly in like a school that's tough to work in, I think that's quite a common thing to see in international teaching. And I wonder if that's something when we look at other industries, do they experience that same thing? I mean, is it analogous to sports management in football or basketball or any of these sports when they're trying to recover a team? I wonder. I think we often try and make sports analogies with teaching and education sometimes, but I wonder how useful some of those are. Obviously we're talking about borrowing from other sectors, but I guess you have to look as well at the commonality of that sector and think about what our core principles are as well.
It's really
No, for
interesting.
sure.
So
And
in
I think,
preparation, oh, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
no, sorry, Morgan. Sorry, I've got a delay here. I apologise. I think it's really interesting if I want to go back to something that Munger would say there in terms of choosing the right person and having the right person. And it's a common thing, the Jim Collins, the right people on the bus as well. But he would always say that to be a good partner, to have a good partner is to be a good partner. And, looking at other sectors and looking at that particular body of work from like Munger and Buffett, they would be very big on putting so much time into the right person that they could then kind of run it themselves, and it has that stability. And if I look kind of I don't want to mention sport, but Man United at the minute, they've gone through cycles of like trying to get the right person and constant change, and it makes something like transformational leadership very difficult because you're constantly going between a different set of ideas and that implementation fatigue. And as we said, that can happen in schools, but in business, what Buffett and Munger would try to do is just make sure that those people were good partners, and they wouldn't necessarily do that through a formal performance management type approach. It would be their values, can they be trusted, have they got a reputation and past history of being a good individual and being a good person for their people, essentially. And I don't mean to um, make that so reductionist when I say it, but there's so much to be said for that because you can then provide that platform, especially if you want to be a transformational leader.
Mm.
I think
And
this is so interesting. There's a few things that I really like there. I think there's this idea of removing barriers. Andrew, when you talked about servant leadership in particular, the idea of removing barriers is really powerful. When you talk about transformational leadership, which again, I think is kind of a bugaboo of mine because it does feel like a lot of what we do in schools badly is change management. And there is implementation fatigue. And we are a sector that constantly says we have this action plan for every single department, we have this school development plan, and we're going to have new priorities every single year. And it can be very repetitive and redundant, some of the plans and priorities that we have in place. And it does feel like we're constantly introducing a new platform or a new idea or a new system that maybe feels like something we did 5 to 8 years ago, or maybe 1 to 2 years ago. And so it's really hard to get staff on board. And at the same time, we are a sector that really desperately wants to innovate. And when COVID hit, we had to innovate. In preparation for this podcast, I put together a few quotes just from other industries, so leaders from other industries about leadership. And I thought some of them were really interesting when it came to change management. So when we look at when we look at something like disruption, so Clayton Christensen said, in business, if you don't disrupt yourself, someone else will, with the idea that we constantly need to reinvent ourselves. McKinsey and Company. So agile organizations thrive by being adaptive and responsive to change. And I think agility has become a huge buzzword in leadership and organizational management since COVID, for instance. And I also love this quote: the secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. Which is a really difficult thing to do in schools, I think. Schools are big, heavy, old ships that we are trying to turn the wheels. And every once in a while, we think we're going to hit an iceberg and we just can't turn them in time. And that quote is from Socrates. So we have to think about, how do we successfully reinvent ourselves when we want to? And do we have the goodwill of staff to do so? What were you thinking, Todd?
yeah, I think there's room for caution in all of that as well, because I think a lot of schools get very excited by all the shiny things and they forget to do the basics. But I do agree with the disruption idea, that you must disrupt yourself before, time or, events or whatever it's going to be disrupts you. It's that kind of the classic sort of ladder of inference, I think, isn't it? Where you're constantly saying, right, here's what I think we're doing. What's my evidence base for that? Does that seem logical? What do other people think? What are other people's inferences at this point? Going through and continually sort of considering what are the fundamentals, the basics of what we do on a daily basis, and are we doing them as well as they can be done? And do we have capacity to add something else or something more? Because I think you're right. I think the idea that in schools we're often saying, "Oh, it's this program. If we just buy this resource, then we'll be fine," without actually really thinking for a long, long time, sort of sharpening the axe and thinking about what it is exactly the problem is, where exactly on the tree we need to chop for it to fall, and really spending time on that section. I think we tend, not all schools and not all leaders, but a lot of schools and a lot of leaders, I think, rush towards, right, what have other people done? How have they bought the solution? What's our neighbour doing who's really, really good at schools? What are they doing? Oh, they've bought this. We should buy that too. And I think just disrupting that and kind of looking at the fundamentals is probably a very, very worthy pursuit. I'm not sure about some of the other stuff about constantly sort of trying to innovate and push things forward, because I'm not sure that gives that obsession with innovation actually gives enough room to really mastering fundamentals. Does that make sense? I'm trying to articulate a few things there.
No, I think that you're making a lot of sense, actually. There is that delicate balance between, like, oh, we are an innovative school, for instance, and we change a lot and it's confusing. And I think the idea of principles is really powerful. When we look at the idea of a lattice work of mental models, what are leadership principles that we could take from business, from healthcare, or tech that could be applied to education? And I think this question is really interesting because I think that education is fundamentally different than other industries. One of the reasons is, and I've mentioned this word before, is goodwill. I think that education is funny because we build these communities that rely a lot on the goodwill of teachers to go above and beyond. And so, one of the things that you have to do in education that you might not have to do in other industries is you need to build up a lot of social capital. So when you ask staff to do things, they feel like they are buying in and they are on board. Otherwise, you get kind of a tick box approach. And the thing is about teachers, about schools in general, is that people constantly go above and beyond because they care about the kids. And so, how do we direct their energies into something that would be the most impactful? And I think that's what's really hard. We can borrow things from business, healthcare, or tech, but we might not get the results that we want because we can't get teachers to believe in it. Um, just as an example, my husband works in technology, and he was talking to me about assertive leadership and how he thought that was something that was really powerful. The idea of being like, yes, I can see your point, but we will be doing it this way instead. Not in a way that's kind of
Mhm.
to micromanage, but to be very clear that this is the expectation and this is the direction that we're going in. And there's not really that much wiggle room for dissent. And I feel like in schools, we aren't assertive leaders in that way because we fundamentally aren't dictatorial because we again depend on goodwill. So with that in mind, Andrew, this is one of the questions that I really wanted to ask you because we were looking at different domains. What are principles that we can take from other sectors that might be really useful?
So I think it's hard because there's so many domains to look at, and I think for me it's more about looking at problem solving and then taking approaches from different domains there and how they approach problems. So I think one thing you said there, Morgan, for example, about building the buy-in and the social capital, that's really important. And a lot of industries do that really well, and a lot of industries do that really bad. And fundamentally, what that comes down to is understanding the problem. And to kind of go to what Todd said, in education, because of the kind of complexity of the problems we're dealing with, it means that it's going to be a constant challenge, and to get the full context of a problem is always going to be difficult, and that's what we should strive to do. And a lot of businesses and other disciplines maybe don't have that same dilemma, from a sense of it is supplier and customer, it is business to business. There's not a lot of other stakeholders around the problem, and that's what can be difficult from education's point of view. So taking almost these mental tools and a toolbox of mental models is where we can, rather than apply specific, um, how would I put it, specific ideas from disciplines, you could take their approach to problems and apply that to education instead. So, for example, if I looked at one of Munger's favorite mental models, it was inversion. And rather than thinking a problem through forward, starting at the end, thinking about how to avoid really bad decision, and then work backwards from there. So I've been thinking there when Todd was talking about the fundamentals, and something I did with my team at the start of the year this year was we wanted to really develop our department values. And the question that we posed was, what are the values of an effective teacher? And we had a little brainstorm about it, and we thought about it. Uh, and then we switched the question up to, what would be the values of a really bad teacher? And what that did was, that inversion, it unlocked the problem from a different angle, and we got a few great things out of it that we wouldn't have otherwise. And it was a really good way to build that together. And I think that approach can help approach some of the complexity, if that makes sense.
No,
That is
definitely.
so brilliant.
Definitely, and one of the things in Woodward's book that he talks about is, again, this chap who set him off thinking, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember his name, but I read this a while ago now, so I'll forgive myself a little. But he said to him, "What's the basis of rugby?" Well, I then started asking people in schools, and the number of people that gave me really bluster sort of answers, just full of fluff and nonsense, really. And I asked my wife, who at the time was working in early years, she's now in year two, but I said, "What's the fundamental thing that you must get right every day in order to do your job really well?" And Woodward gives the example of like a theme park, and he's like, if you ask everyone what the fundamental thing a theme park must do, they'll tell you create enjoyment, create entertainment. And he's like, that's not it. It's safety. Safety is the fundamental single word of a theme park, because if that goes wrong, nothing else works. And I hadn't prompted my wife at all, but I just said, "What is it that you, as an early years teacher, what is the fundamental thing?" And she just said, "It's a single word. It's care." And I was like, "That's brilliant. That's just literally bang. That's what it is." But I love that idea of inverting that and sort of asking staff, what are the things that someone who was doing this really badly would be doing? You know, what are the what are the bad principles? I love that.
It's funny. I remember doing this with actually, I remember doing this with a group of teachers, and we were looking at hosting an event. We're doing like a teach meet. And one of the things that we wanted to do was a pre mortem. And the pre mortem was brilliant. It was that idea of inversion. We thought of all the things that could possibly go wrong, and then we made preparation for it. And I think about this in leadership as well. So, one of the things that I've done as a leader on SLT is we've actually gamed out what is the worst case scenario in emergency situations that could happen in a school, and what are the different tacks that we would take. Where would we be? Who would be in charge of doing what? And just kind of thinking in general principles. If there was an emergency in a school, there's no panic then. Where are our stations? What are our roles? Where are our priorities? It's really, really useful. So I think that the idea of inversion is really great. It's a really fantastic tool. One of the things that when I was looking at this too, was the idea of loss aversion, which I think is really interesting. So sometimes people fear losing something more than they value gaining something. So how do we change behavior Because I think this is really true in schools. People stay for a long time and they fear of losing a system that's not working, but they've just, I'm sure you've heard this before, but like, oh, we've done it that way forever, more than they value gaining something because change is hard. How do we change that?
Well, that's an interesting one, Morgan. It's something that requires a lot of thought, though, isn't it? Because you're dead on. And I was talking to somebody the other day in my school because we had a few staff absences, for example, and we had to arrange some cover. And the idea of a teacher losing a free lesson, for example, it always weighs so much heavier than getting a bit of time back. You know what I mean? That's what I've found in terms of that loss aversion. But equally, like you say, any time I can think back when I've tried to implement a new system with my team, there is that sticking point, of that's not the way we do it. Like, how is it going to change? And to be honest with you, it's probably something I've not done particularly well in the past. And one of the things I've learned from speaking to so many amazing people is that understanding of the problem again, right? And I think one of the things that can help with loss aversion is making sure you understand the context of the problem and getting the teachers' input, getting the parents' input, getting the students' input, and trying to really see the problem for everything that it's worth, rather than, oh, we've got this new system, I think it's going to be the solution, coming to something that we think is going to be the solution.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think one of the things that they say with like business is it the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule?
20.
And I think when we think about kind of business strategy and being efficient and having systems thinking, I feel like that's something we should bring more to schools, because schools are one of those places where we can be incredibly traditional and old fashioned in the way that we do things. And a lot of it is very admin heavy. This is a place or an entire workforce that is definitely suffering from burnout. And we can definitely argue that 80% of teacher stress comes from 20% of our tasks, which tend to be really low value administration tasks. And change might be really easy if we automated things or eliminated things. But it can be really hard to do that. I think that if we applied some more business efficiency to schools, some more systems thinking to schools, we had different feedback loops, then we would be able to do things like avoid burnout and making schools more streamlined and efficient. I think we'll just take a minute now just to hear a word from our sponsors.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Hello and welcome back. This is Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan on the Friday Lunch Show with our guest, Andrew Wilkinson. And we are talking about Charlie Munger's approach to leadership. So looking at lattice work and mental models and applying things from different sectors, domains, disciplines, and how that could actually work out in schools. So we were talking before about different principles that we could use. So we talked about loss aversion. We have talked a little bit about the idea of inversion, which is really a fantastic way to kind of, I guess, backwards plan things, which is really great. One of the things that I wanted to look at was the idea of decision fatigue within organizations, because I think that's something that as leaders, we often don't take into consideration. I have just had one of those days. It's Friday. And sometimes, by 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, you feel like you have made 6,000 different decisions, little tiny decisions, but decisions that can make or break someone's day, or like transform how much work they have to do in a week, or take back something that needs to be taken back, or future plan something. So I think that decision fatigue is a really interesting thing that leaders have to play with all the time in schools, because we are constantly answering to so many different types of demands. So just thinking about that and the kind of diverse things that leaders in schools have to make decisions on every single day, how can we make better decisions as leaders in schools? Is there any kind of principles or ideas that we can take from outside of education to make better decisions?
Yeah, so Morgan, sorry, I was just thinking there. I was really trying to get my thinking right before I started speaking. And one thing, is to really think about the type of decisions that are happening, right? So I think, from my perspective, if I think about a genuine day, um, there's a lot of the decisions that I would class as not low capacity, but low thinking, right? And then there's the complex problems. And I think one thing that I've really tried to do a lot of thinking around at the minute, I've just been reading Robinson's Virtuous Leadership. I was
Mm,
talking to Todd about it yesterday, and
Yeah.
her, I think it's complex collaborative problem solving is her model. And they work through all the stages. Everybody has input. It's carefully monitored, and then when a problem is essentially solved, I use it in with a little hyphen next to it, or a little asterisk, sorry. And the idea is then, though, that becomes a routine. And
mm.
ideally speaking, those complex problems that have been solved become a routine, and that then should feed into your almost low capacity decisions. So if that's been done well over time, you've got this routine that you can either go back to and refresh people or remind people of, or reevaluate and go through the whole model again and update the routine. And I suppose it's very idealistic to say that, but the aim for schools should be, and leaders, to solve as many of those complex problems as you can, make them routines, and then you've got the ability to have almost not a low capacity decision, but you've got a framework, you've got a model straight away you can push somebody to, and it shouldn't take up that same amount of time as the initial complex solving of the problem.
Oh, I feel like I've just really told on myself. Because you're absolutely right. If you have decision fatigue and you're making a lot of decisions really quickly, that says something about the system, that you are constantly having to make decisions, as opposed to ensuring that there are systems where not that many decisions need to be made because they are habits. They're ingrained routines. The expectations are really clear. There are no questions. I think that that is actually really, really true. Um, and very good advice to make them routines. I really, really like that actually. I think that's very sage and something that I will take with me at the end of this podcast.
Andrew, do you think
Okay.
that can be replaced to some extent with principles and values, then agreed upon principles and values, or do you think it all has to be kind of routines within a school?
I mean, I'm very. I need a routine because I'm very habit driven. But I understand it's a good point. I mean, I suppose again, an ideal world, an ideal school, if you've got those guiding principles, then people act in accordance with those. You would expect almost not a uniform approach to problems, but at least virtuous, I suppose, or at least in line with the values. For me, just the complexity involved with so many aspects of school life, I would like the idea of routines, I think,
Yeah,
and
it's
trying to
just as
build
you were
that.
talking there, I was thinking about, doctors and various professions will have something like a "do no harm" or something like that. Like a kind of um, a motto or an aphorism that kind of covers quite a lot of the decision making. And yet, someone like a pilot, will have a series of steps and processes that they have to follow through. And obviously, we're thinking today a little bit about where we can borrow and make analogies from other industries. And as you were talking there, I was thinking, yeah, a lot of the time, you're making decisions on the fly in education, aren't you? You can't kind of go to a manual at all times. So I was just wondering about that, about the idea of principles. I mean, do we have some things like do no harm? Is it something like ask for and expect, or there has to be some sort of consequence? Is probably the wrong word. It sounds punitive, but you know what I mean. When we're dealing with children, there's certain principles that are probably fairly universal, no matter what type of school that you're running. I don't know. Just a thought.
Well, it's interesting, and I suppose to go a little bit further on that, one of the things that Munger was really big on was the idea of psychology, right?
Mhm.
And particularly, he did this great talk. It was called what was it called? Sorry, let me just try and think. The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. And he laid out a bunch of principles in there that he thought were really paramount from psychology that impacted in all walks of life. And I think the first principle maybe was around incentives. And I think there's this thing, and it's been really not troubling to me, but something I've really thought about a lot recently is incentives in teaching. And I think for the majority of teachers, they get into the line of work, they get into the profession because they want to make a difference to students' lives, the kids' lives, they want to work with children. Um, but that's not the case for everybody. And from an incentive structure, that if people who come into the profession for the right reasons have that almost guiding light, they have that intrinsic incentive, but that's not the case for everybody. And again, I'm going to be tread carefully here, particularly in international education. You might have teachers who've maybe just moved abroad for an easier life, or they've moved abroad for whatever reason, right? Teaching isn't the main reason, and from an incentive point of view, I think it can be really challenging about how to get that right. And again, Munger had a great quote, and it was like, let me just make sure I get it right. What was it? He said, "If you show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome." And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this recently in relation to performance management, right? And the old fashioned kind of percentage based targets of students who meet X, Y, and Z. And that can be a bad incentive because the incentive is just to get that number, and can encourage, tread carefully again, can encourage kind of gaming of the system. And I know I've read Data Proof in Your School. The author's names escape me, for example, but they say the same thing. You should never have a performance management target linked to student outcomes, for example. And that to me strikes me as an incentive in schools that can be really detrimental to development and teacher development. I don't know if you guys agree. I'm really intrigued about it. I've just been thinking a lot about it.
That is really fascinating. So as soon as you said incentives, I'm like, well, what incentivizes teachers, and what are incentives in teaching? And two things immediately came to mind. The first thing that came to my mind was the very first time that I came to a school and I was given in my job role KPIs. Key performance indicators, which is a term that I would kind of exclusively associated with business and kind of like reaching your sales numbers. And I was given KPIs, but they had nothing to do with my actual, and they were measurable, but they had nothing to do with my actual job. And it was almost laughable. Like we had KPIs, but they didn't really mean much, and they didn't really incentivize me in any way, because that wasn't an intrinsic motivation that I was invested in. So I thought about that. And the other thing that came to the front of my mind, was that we do have places in the world where teachers are paid bonuses for getting certain academic outcomes from their students. And there's a few funny stories that are out there of teachers helping their students cheat on tests so that they could get their bonuses. And I could imagine that if you want your students to do well and you are working towards that goal for an financial incentive, it might not be the most fun experience to be a student in that classroom, because it might be about getting the right answer on a test, not necessarily student learning. So I think that incentives is a really funny word to use in education. Is this a strange reaction that I'm having?
I probably would suspect not. I would actually find that type of bonus quite motivating. I'll be completely honest, but it wouldn't motivate me in the sense of right. I'm now going to just teach towards the test, or certainly not to cheat. It would just kind of it would gamify the thing for me. So I would kind of think to myself, right, what things can I do that maximize this classroom, and actually that might make me think a little bit more about the experience as well. So I suppose it depends on how you see that incentive as well, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about perverse incentives, and I think we've spoken before on the show, Morgan, about the Cobra effect. That classic example from India in the times of the British Empire, where the British rewarded them for catching more snakes. So the Indians cleverly started farming snakes, which is brilliant, really. Just like some old school British imperialists sort of sat around going, "These are doing really great, actually. Lovely snake catchers, really fabulous." And actually, they're just really good at farming snakes now. So I do see the concern with it, but yeah, I think it would depend very much on the individual. And you mentioned about KPIs, and I think that would be something where when I speak to people from outside of our sector, they do seem to suggest that we've misunderstood it. You've listed a few of them there, Morgan, but what surprised me most speaking to people outside of our sector is that they'll adjust KPIs based on what seems to be reasonable now. So rather than just sort of hammering each other and saying, right, we thought you'd be able to achieve this, and you've only got 3 months to achieve it, so you best start working even harder. They go, it doesn't look possible now, actually, does it? Should we just move the goal post a little bit there so that we can kind of still hit a desirable target, but one that might be more reasonable and achievable? Which might explain why other industries don't have quite the retention issues we do. But perverse incentives in education, I think is it connected to the nature of the sector, that the reason that we're all in it is probably quite different. For me, it would be those opening the envelope moments that happen in the summer, opening the results, or the conversations years after where they see you and say, I really, really still read to this day. I really enjoyed English, or even I didn't like it at the time. I thought you were being a bit mean on us and a bit asking a bit much. But now when I think back to it, I'm really writing these academic essays, and my tutors comment on how well I write. Things like that. Those are the moments that I do it for. Well, how would you incentivize that? I have arranged, Mr. Brennan, for you to meet former students. Like it's a very strange profession in terms of incentives, I think.
I think that's an
It's
interesting
very
one, Todd, because the incentives you're talking about there and the things that drive you is that intrinsic thing that's probably linked to wanting to make students' lives better, right? Like that's everything you've talked about there.
Definitely.
But I think there's something that's intriguing to me about, again, I'm trying not to be so crass when I say it, but incentivizing the behavior you want to see, right? So again, been reflecting a lot recently on updating performance management, right? And again, having X, Y, and Z target that is linked to a quantitative value, right? Like X amount of students getting above, below expected, right? Or again, hopefully it's an outdated thing, but something like a grading and a lesson observation, right? And then say your pay is based on that performance management, right? Which again, hopefully, performance related pay isn't that big of a thing. But from speaking to colleagues, I think it's still something that can be quite prevalent. And in that structure, the incentive is not to develop as a teacher, for example. It's just to hit X, Y, and Z target. And that's something that I've tried to do a lot of thinking around in terms of incentivizing the things that we'd want to see from teachers, right? So making sure they're engaging with evidence informed practice and make sure they're listening to podcasts like this, for example, and trying to incentivize that behavior. So not trying to think of it necessarily about like why did you get into the career, or something like that, but trying to make it about what small pockets of everyday teaching life can we attach some form of incentive to that would have a beneficial impact. And I think other businesses and other disciplines do that quite well. And teaching, it's just difficult because it's so complex and because there's so many aspects to it. And again, I
Yeah,
don't know
and
what you guys think about that.
well, I'm going to contradict myself here, but as you're talking then, I think in some ways I'm saying that we shouldn't worry about being so innovative, we should nail basics and da. But as you're talking, I went on a little journey about thinking about this idea of what if we asked them a really strange question. You know, I used to read a lot of Tim Ferriss's book when he was the big thing when I was sort of early 20s. And he's a big fan of these sort of unusual questions. And I was thinking, what if you said to teachers, what remarkable things do you think you'll have achieved by the end of this year? You know, and then of course, then that's based on what you think is remarkable. I reckon by the end of the year, I'm going to have met, I'm new to the school and I'm going to have met every single student in this school and I'm going to know their names. Right, okay, well, that's your target then. You know, I think I'm going to achieve everyone in my bottom set are going to get over a 6 in their GCSEs. Well, if that motivates you and you think you can do it, great. You know, whatever it is, what remarkable things or what impossible things do you think you might be able to do? But perhaps that's one of the problems with this idea of a sort of a lattice framework of borrowing from others. I do think if you went into a school today, if you went back with that as your performance management model, Andrew, I think everyone would think you'd gone mad. But it would actually incentivize a lot of people based on what they individually feel is important, what they're already working really hard on. But it would be so outlandish within the sector that you'd probably be ridiculed, I suspect. So I'm saying on the one hand, we need to be more interested in the fundamentals and the basics, but perhaps as well, there's innovation in areas of thinking that we don't currently do. And I think addressing performance management is a really interesting problem that you've taken on there, Andrew, actually.
For all my sins, Todd, I'm sure. Well, I mean, even the term performance management, right? Sorry, Molly.
Oh no, continue. You're about to say something that I really believe in. I hate the term performance management. I am fundamentally against it, so please continue.
Right. No, I was then just rethinking like performance management, maybe not necessarily the best term, but performance development could be a better term, for example, right? But then, you know, the incentive shifts from how do you incentivize development versus how do you incentivize management? At the heart of the problem, and it's again very complex and difficult to get right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. We're going to have to go on our news break soon, but I just wanted to add this, the idea of like what incentivizes teachers. I think that we could say, we could pay teachers more if they get these results. But I think a lot of the things that incentivize teachers, if we were to encourage them to do better in the classroom, I think would be time. I think that almost every teacher that you would talk to is time poor. And the thing that would give them the most improvement in their performance, if we want to call it that, would be time to be at full capacity so that they could feel more present, that we give them back time through streamlining admin tasks, which I mentioned before, but also the idea of time being something that's precious, that is an incentive. Like when I think about if I do this, then I will have more time, or if I can give time back to a teacher. A lot of the time we talk about gain time at the end of term 3 in a school, getting ready for the next year. Like that seems like precious. So I think time is something that could be incentivized in some way. And I'm not sure if schools have done that, but that's something that I would be interested in, because that's what I feel like I want the most. I want more time to do my job really well. Anyways, let's move on to the news, then we can come back. We have a few more questions.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
According to Schools Week, Orc National Academy have announced the appointment of a new interim CEO. This comes as the online school sets a leaving date for its current boss, Matt Hood, now due to step down at the end of March. Director of Product and Engineering John Roberts is named as the temporary leader. Roberts was part of the team that launched the organisation 5 years ago. In the article, Roberts is quoted as saying, "Oak has an important role to play going forward, supporting curriculum standards, tackling workload, and innovating using AI." Matt Hood had acted as interim chief executive since Oak became an arm's-length public body in 2022. The recruitment process for Hood lasted a year, and the Department for Education confirmed his appointment to a permanent position in May 2024. Oak have stressed that Hood's permanent replacement will be selected following the principles of the public appointments process. Schools Week reported in November that a judicial review of the decision to turn the Oak National Academy into a government quango had been put on hold due to concerns expressed by other groups that Oak would pose an existential risk to their sector. Oak published its last impact report in October, which said more than 1 in 3 teachers had used Oak resources between February and July last year. Almost 75% said its resources had saved them time over the same period. BBC Tees focuses on the issue of young carers being, in the words of a local head teacher, unfairly marked as late to school as a result of having to drop off siblings. 4 areas in the northeast of England, including Newcastle and Sunderland, have the highest rate of school absences in the country, according to the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. The head of a school in the region spoke to the BBC and said it was unfair to mark child carers as absent because they had responsibilities, such as helping a disabled parent to get out of bed. He went on to say that changes to attendance guidance had created an unfair system, meaning lateness after registers closed resulted in a U mark for an unauthorised absence for a morning session, even if the pupil was only half an hour late. The head teacher went on to say that the reality was that these pupils were at school most of the day. Analysis of the Department for Education figures by the Powerhouse found that the top 9 areas for unauthorised absence were in the north. Northern Powerhouse Partnership CEO said the figures were indicative of high levels of deprivation and an educational north-south divide. A spokesperson for the Department for Education said it had inherited an absence crisis, but was laser-focused on tackling the problem. The Guardian covers a story about a secondary school head teacher who has obtained a court order to be paid damages in the settlement of a legal claim against abusive parents who he alleged launched a campaign of harassment against him. The head teacher was successful in his claim against the parents of 2 former pupils who he said had been harassing him since May 2023. The parents' alleged behaviour included starting an online petition to remove the head teacher from his role and establishing Facebook groups and Instagram accounts which encouraged online abuse against him. The couple were also accused of confronting the head teacher and the school's co-chair of governors outside their homes, although the couple denied this. The legal settlement was reached in January and the couple agreed to pay £10,000 in costs and damages, and agreed to multiple restraining and non-harassment orders. Full details of the story can be found online. Finally, the BBC West Midlands News website reports on a primary school who have begun training pupils in Year 5 and Year 6 to be mental health ambassadors. The school in Wolverhampton has begun teaching a programme to help children manage emotions following investment from West Midlands Violence Reduction Partnership. 20 pupils, including those with special educational needs, are being taught how to be upstanders so they can look out for younger children. Upstanders look out for those who might be being bullied and show that bullying is not okay. The upstanders wear high visibility blue jackets on the playground during break, and younger pupils can ask them for help. The scheme has had a positive impact on the school, says the report. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Hello and welcome back. This is Teachers Talk Radio, the Friday lunchtime show with Morgan and Todd and our guest, Andrew. So we are going to continue talking about mental models for leadership. And we were just discussing incentives. And I think one of the things we were talking about different types of leadership styles at the top of this show. And one of the things that we always have to remember is that we teach such a diversity of people who are all going to be incentivized in different ways for different reasons. And I was thinking about this idea of types of teachers kind of affected by incentives by how they want to be led and managed. I was reading a really interesting article that looked at management structures and how when we take a look at Gen Z, when we take a look at Gen X, and we take a look at millennials, they respond very differently to different management styles. And it's really, really fascinating to me, the idea that we might have an outdated form of leadership in schools that might be alienating some generations or a subset of teachers in particular, because we aren't perhaps an industry that is as agile or as innovative. And we are more hierarchical. We are less distributive. The very nature of schools is kind of that way. So I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure if this is something that actually exists, but I was looking at some ideas about Gen Z. So Gen Z would typically be those digital natives. They're born in the late 90s to about 2012. And when I think about teachers who are digital natives, who want purpose-driven learners, they want authenticity, inclusivity, mentorship. They want to be inspired and guided. They're tech savvy. They want frequent feedback. I think they're more into like social justice. Like that's what I think of when I think of Gen Z. And when we look at those younger teachers that are coming in, are our systems and educational leadership styles matching what Gen Z need? Andrew, Todd, what do you think?
I should probably hold my tongue because I'll probably get myself into trouble.
I mean, see, I'm just trying to figure
I
out
don't.
which category I fall into. I think
I was going to say, Andrew, aren't you Gen Z?
no,
You're a young
not that.
duckling there.
I think I'm on the dying embers of millennial. But it's interesting, man.
I'm barely a millennial, so I'm taking my millennial status. But yeah, I think Gen Z would be a little bit younger than me. But I can definitely see the appeal when I think about Gen Z's values and Gen Z's needs. I can definitely understand them. Just for comparison, millennials are supposed to be more collaborative and purpose driven, and they would really flourish under servant and transformational leadership. They would want to feel supported. They wouldn't like hierarchical either. And they really like the idea of servant leaders, collaborative decision making, well-being would be something that's really important. By stark contrast, Gen X's would be very independent and pragmatic, much more old school, results driven, autonomy driven, direct communication, very practical, skeptical of trends, but very responsive when it comes to evidence-based leadership decisions. So those would be, again, in broad strokes, those three different kind of generations. Todd, what are your thoughts? I know that you have them.
What about Scorpios? How do they go on?
Tread carefully, sir.
I think I remember being quite young in my first job. My first ever job I was about 15. I might have been a bit younger. My first sort of professional job would be about 21, 22. I didn't like the leadership style because at 21 and at 15, you don't want a leadership style from someone who's in charge. You want to just muck around and not do any work, probably. Certainly at 15. I don't know. I'm listening to some of this, and obviously the broad brushstrokes thing, that has to be acknowledged, that across generations, there's going to be multiple personality types, multiple different motivators, cultural motivators, financial motivators, just to name two. But I just wonder about the pampering and the erosion of adult authority that we're maybe enabling with some of this. I mean, bad leadership is bad leadership, don't get me wrong. If you've got an absolute dictatorial leader who goes out of their way just to make people feel horrible so that they're in control. I don't think it matters what generation you're in or what star sign you are, but I worry sometimes that these young people are coming out to work, 21, sometimes in primary schools, maybe a little older in secondary schools because of the nature of the training model, certainly in the UK. But they're looking to those older than them for guidance and for support and for how to be a professional adult. I mean, at 21, 50, 30 years ago, yeah, maybe arguably more people had jobs, maybe they were more adult. But that to me would suggest a need for greater guidance and greater, maybe adult authorities, an uncomfortable word there in that context of support. But I don't know, it just all feels quite arbitrary and a little bit like pandering to people when actually what they probably need is more important than what they want or what they feel they need. I tend to not go to my doctor and tell him what I think I need. And I kind of feel the same way about this with a young teacher. They probably don't know what they need or what's good for them just at that stage. So I don't know. Maybe I'm a 38-year-old dinosaur, but I just worry about some of this because I know of a friend in the UK who's a head teacher who had to sit with a 23-year-old recent graduate teacher and their mum to receive feedback recently. And I think that's just so worrying that's what's coming through out of universities now is people who bring their mum to feedback meetings. And I don't know if kind of adapting and changing styles beyond doing what is best for the school and what is best for the individuals and the community, I don't know if changing based on their wants and needs is the best approach. Aside from the concern about are we wondering about how many Libras we've got in the room and how many Scorpios and
No,
what's the
I
other
was
one?
really thinking it's more like how do we retain and create good teachers? Like if our leadership style is not working and we are rapidly losing out on great teachers because they're leaving the profession, which we are, maybe it's not them that's the problem because they have fluffy ideas about like how they should be treated and mentored, but instead maybe we should change ourselves. I say this as the dinosaur amongst the three of us on this show.
Well, you're not ideologically and cognitively the dinosaur, so that's probably a good thing and the main thing. But I think sometimes, I suppose what I'm saying is what you think you need and what you think you want is not always what's good for you. And if people are leaving the profession, that might be symptomatic of both of the things that either of us are describing. That might not be an indicator of one or the other. It might be an indicator that actually these young people are not set up for work because, as I said, how many young people now go and get a part-time job? That's becoming rarer and rarer, according to most statistics I've seen. So, getting up, being on time for meetings, wearing the your work attire appropriately, not missing a deadline, all these things that perhaps would have been inculcated when you had your first job at a farm or an off license or a restaurant or wherever it was that you got your first job at 14 or 15 back in the day. Even your paper round, if you forgot to deliver a paper, someone would have something to say about it. They're not doing that now. So I wonder are we losing staff because they can't cope with it because no one's taught them really how to have a job? It could be the thing, is what I'm saying.
Todd, I think there's this thing that all generations do where they think that the generations after them are lazier. I feel like baby
No,
boomers
not
thought that
lazier.
about millennials.
Not
I
lazier at
don't think it's a
all.
real thing.
No, not
I think
lazier. I think they're less prepared for the world of work because they have worked less. And that's
I'm not sure. I
data.
think they work in a different way. Just to say this, like my parents would never let me take a part-time job during the school year because they said my
Yeah,
job was work. Now that is a sign of privilege, and I recognize that like I was
yeah,
privileged that I didn't have to work a part-time job during the school year.
yeah.
Um, and I think that I don't think that it's fair to say because I think students or I think that younger generations, they've worked in different ways. They might have done more volunteer work. They may have done more work experience. They're definitely more likely than we were to have done an unpaid internship. They're coming into a workforce, or they've done work that is definitely lower paid. They're working in a gig economy. The reality for those younger than us is not that they have less work experience, it's that they have consistently been less rewarded for work that they've done, and the work that they've done is less recognized. So yeah,
But,
I
but
think I
objectively,
come squarely down
they
on
are
the
doing
idea.
less. They are doing less rubbish jobs. You know, they are objectively. You've named it there. They're not going into being a pot washer in a restaurant and having to take dog years of abuse. You know, they haven't done that. And then when they go into the sector, their expectations are higher. I think we're roughly saying the same thing as always. But I just think that perhaps there's a gentle guiding hand required in kind of taking them on that journey of saying, no, unfortunately, the role cannot be adapted for your. This is the role. I don't know. I think the broad
Well,
brushstrokes of generations
why don't we ask
is
Andrew?
problematic in itself. Yeah, we could, couldn't
Sorry,
we?
Andrew, you be the
No,
tiebreaker. You be the peacemaker. Todd and I might
I am.
agree, or we might strongly disagree. What do you think? Do you think that we should be changing our leadership style for this new generation of teachers that are coming up?
I'm just sitting enjoying the show, guys. Don't worry about me. I'm enjoying the heavyweights going in. No, I think it's interesting listening because for me, I was trying to think about two things, and I don't want to sound like I don't want to give it the old Simon Sinek because I don't want to get overused. But in what Todd's saying, is it a case of how the leader communicates, why they're why they don't want to adapt their role, or why they want to do things a certain way in terms of like feedback or something like that? Like, it's important for you to hear this because I want you to do. So like, just sometimes people from different generations maybe assume that the younger generations um, know that we're acting in ideally and hopefully a way that is going to guide them and support their career, or our leaders getting alongside them, and as I would hope they would, and being like, look, I want you to have a successful career, and this is an important part, and this is why you need to hear X, Y, and Z, or this is why working in this way will be beneficial. And then it goes almost at odds at like that, not autonomy, but trying to incorporate different ways of working. I think it's a balancing act, right? And equally, then when you were talking, I'm thinking, right, well, again, is it incentives? Like, is it a case of not monetarily, but Morgan mentioned time, for example. Maybe younger generations coming in, and certainly anecdotally, my experiences is the teachers and the younger teachers, particularly, they do want time, right? And then they go through almost like an arc, and then you've got certain teachers going into parenthood who again one time like, and it's adjusting, and I think there's something in that, and it's being flexible to deal with the individual. uh, and, and then I don't want to sit on the fence too much here, but like the individuals in different generations can still hold similar values, right? And again, I know we're talking broad brushstrokes, but teaching has an element, unlike any other profession, to maybe contradict the whole starting point of the show, where there needs to be a teacher in front of the children at a certain time, and you can never change that, right? Or that's not going to change. You can't incorporate a home remote work and that aspect, right? But it's thinking
Yeah.
cleverly about, well, could we at certain points, right? Or speaking to a Gen Z employee and being like, right, we're not going to let you go home during this free because it's going to be more important for you to go and see teacher X, Y, and Z. And I'm doing this because, or I'm saying this because I really want you to have a successful career. Do you know what I mean? And I think there's something in the communication
I
aspect
think
there.
there's things there. I love what you said. Like, I think I do agree. There's something about we have structures that are fundamentally inflexible, which make it hard for teachers at different stages of life. Um, And I think flexibility is something that the profession really needs to work at if we expect to have teachers be really productive and to be educators long term. I think what's really interesting is the idea of loyalty, because I feel like the loyalty that we once might have felt towards our workplace, that is slowly being eroded. And I think it's the idea that at any moment we could be let go if we're not seen as a great teacher, if we're not doing a good enough job, or we're not going to be, or we might be let go for other reasons that might be a business decision. We're all a family and we all work to our utmost capacity for the good of the kids, but we're not going to financially reward you for that. It's not going to, I could see how this idea of loyalty and this idea of you say that we're a family, but we are not. I could see how that would be really infuriating if you are someone coming into the profession. And I think that that might be something that's missing because again, we are an industry that is completely on the, I guess our foundation is one of goodwill. Again, we ask more and more of our teachers, and they do go above and beyond. So if we don't show loyalty to them, how can we expect that to be a two-way street? Does that make sense, Todd? If you were to look at at this generational breach?
Repeat the question, sorry.
I was just thinking about loyalty as a driver. Like we were looking at incentives before.
Around with loyalty, sorry. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting problem, isn't it? Because I think in the past it was seen as, and this is very much the problem in Irish education, it's a job for life. And that was very much before performance management in the UK. I think that was the thing. You were a part of that school for life. And obviously that means
Yeah.
then the school has a loyalty to develop you and to work with you. And you have a loyalty to the school because, you're going to be there for a long time and they will work with you. Now, obviously not every teacher stayed at every school forever. But it depends very much on the context, doesn't it? The Irish problem there is that I believe that it's quite hard to get rid of teachers once they're in post. Now, I could be wrong there. It's not the system that I'm from, but I
Yeah.
know
Well, I
that.
think you never should. You should always be supporting teachers to become better. But yeah.
Yeah, but the problem that they have then on that side is that as a school, you're placing a lot of goodwill on an individual, and not every individual is going to repay that. So with loyalty, as we know, we told this from a young age, aren't you? It's a two-way street. I think one of the issues is if schools are firing people quite quickly and not working with people, then it isn't surprising then that loyalty isn't a driving force for teachers, and survival is a negative driving force, isn't it? And that's quite a unique person who thrives off the fear of losing. They do exist, but I think it's
Yes.
quite rare.
Yeah.
So just to pick up on something Andrew said as well, I think what you described there, Andrew, just sounds like really good management that would work across any generation. We're doing this because of this. I want you to stay because I want you to do this, because I actually believe you're going to be a really good teacher. You're probably going to be the best teacher I've got, actually, at some point. I really believe in you. Whatever it is that you say to that individual, that just to me sounds like really effective leadership that would work regardless of which generation you were talking to. So two quick things there, connecting to what you both said.
No, nice thought. I think that's really thoughtful, and it's just a difficult issue. Even he you speak there about loyalty. It's like how does that change? And thinking generationally, do younger teachers now, do they almost see it as a job versus a profession or a vocation? And
Yeah.
speaking broad strokes, but then how does that impact things? And I don't know, man.
Well, they're a
It's
I'm
really
going
generation
away
that's
more
grown up
questions.
with. They're a generation that's grown up definitely with ideas like quiet quitting, work-life balance. I think if any of us went and talked to our parents about work-life balance, that would confuse them. But equally, so with this idea of constant emails. So there are adaptations, and I'm not denying that earlier. What I'm saying is that I worry about adapting for people's wants, because what we want is not always what we need, is it? But yeah, we now have a profession where you're almost on call. Some schools set email deadlines, some cut-offs and things like that. But in the backdrop of all of that, ideas like work-life balance and quiet quitting, you can see how they sort of emerge. But I do think that it's fundamentally the nature of the job is most of us could sell our talents to industry for much more, and so there is a vocational element to it. If you join a profession where you know you're underselling yourself, but it speaks to your core purpose, well, then you kind of fundamentally have admitted that it's a vocation, I would say. I mean, maybe that's too cold and calculated.
Well, let's take
I'd say
we're just going to have
idealistic.
one word from our sponsors, and then
Yes.
why don't we have some concluding thoughts from all of us? Because I think my brain exploded when Andrew said something earlier. So yes, one quick word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Okay, so we are back for a few concluding thoughts about leadership and mental models. And it was really fascinating thinking of incentives and thinking about business and psychology when it comes to educational leadership. And one word that really kind of came to mind when Andrew was talking about how we give people purpose and how we sit them down and say, I am going to invest in you, was that kind of businessy word of investment, because that is what we do. I think people will respond, no matter what generation they are in, to the idea that you are invested in their journey as a professional. You are invested in their happiness and their well-being and their sense of purpose. You are invested in their development as a teaching as an educator. I think that there's a lot there, and that if we are investing in people, then we will always be ensuring that our organization thrives. And there's a few different ways to do that. I think when we talked about like leadership and management styles, I think that servant leadership is something where we see like investment really, really, really explicitly emphasized. But yeah, I think that idea, Andrew, of investment, that really resonated with me. Andrew, what are your concluding thoughts? Just kind of wrapping this up.
Just again, not to go for a leadership like cliche, but understanding the problem and again understanding it from as many different angles as possible, and almost seeing these things we're talking about in terms of generational divides are problems to be solved. And realistically, as leaders, the best way to do that is going to be in clear communication and really trying to understand it. I've always had this really like simplistic model as a teacher in terms of relationship with the students. From an age perspective, you almost go from like a older brother or sister, the parent, the grandparent, that it becomes almost like difficult to relate to them, or it would be a challenge. And I'm almost
Mm-hmm.
starting to think about that as relationships to teachers coming in and younger teachers, almost being that brother sister age, and then trying to move through to parental and almost more servant like, and then you know what I mean, moving through to a wiser grandparent type. Obviously, I'm just talking generally there, but I just think there's something interesting there that can maybe be looked at.
No, there is something about that, almost that life cycle as we guide people through the profession. Todd, what are your thoughts to close us off?
Yeah, so there was a few things that Andrew said, particularly some of the questions that Charlie Munger poses, that I think I'm going to have to revisit, and I'm going to have to try and ask Andrew for some additional reading here, because I found that really fascinating. And Andrew and I have spoken off air, and I've spoken. We spoke a lot about borrowing from other professions, but actually, a few things that he said there's made me think, oh, how though? Rather than just kind of. I suppose I was thinking, yeah, it's really great when you explain things to people outside the profession. It's great to borrow things from other people outside of the profession. But that idea of discerning what's useful and what is truly analogous, that Andrew pointed out earlier, I think that's left me not reeling. I nearly said reeling. It's left me thinking deeply and questioning something that I thought was fundamentally true. So I actually really enjoyed that conversation, Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, that was so. I think the idea of using different sectors, different disciplines, it really helps you see blind spots, and it avoids an over reliance on just one approach. And when we're combining models across disciplines, we know that we can come up with better solutions, and help make better decisions. So, Andrew, that was really, really fascinating. Thank you for your expertise and your insight. It was just a lovely way to spend this evening for me, actually, is listening to you. So thank you guys so much for the conversation and debate.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Andrew.
Cheers, guys. You're so kind. Overly kind.
We'll have to talk again soon. I have so many questions. But for now, we will leave everyone. I hope that everyone has an amazing Friday and an excellent weekend. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.